Today, what I'd like to talk about is to describe, largely from my own experience as a reference point, the recovery of Jonathan Edwards that has gone on in the academic and theological and ecclesiastical worlds in the past 60 or 70 years. And since I've been around good bit of that time, I can reflect on it. I think it's actually a quite remarkable recovery. I first encountered the real genius of Jonathan Edwards in 1963. I was beginning studies at Yale University with Sidney Alstrom. And I remember very clearly, I was sitting in it was a very attractive reading room in the Yale Divinity School library. It has nice colonial style windows like this, and the sunlight was streaming through the windows. I was reading, I think it must have been Douglas Elwood's The Philosophical Theology of Jonathan Edwards. And in that, Elwood points out the role of beauty in Edwards' experience. And he was quoting at length from A Divine and Supernatural Light. I still have my copy of the book and have underlined with X's and arrows where Elwood says, "The spiritual sense is without any long chain of arguments. The argument is but one, and the evidence direct." That's quoting from Edwards. And then Elwood, it is overpowering and all-conquering. And then he quotes Edwards from the sermon, "God is God and distinguished chiefly by his divine beauty, which is infinitely diverse from other beauty. And the new sense enables the mind to rise above the sensuous to appreciate the spiritual beauty." And I remember quite vividly reading those lines, and the light was streaming in, and the sort of the lesser beauty of the sunlight was pointing toward the higher beauty that Edwards was talking about. And the effect was not exactly a mystical experience, but it was one of heightening a kind of understanding of something I already was committed to, but intensifying it and giving it some sort of deeper reality. It was one of those, of course, experiences that you sometimes have, and it might be sort of like in holiness movement. They talk about a second blessing where you see things more deeply. And reading Edwards at that time, just things came together. They fell together, and I reflected on the new sense of God's beauty that is involved in true Christian commitment, and that if one is given the eyes to see that beauty, then you're irresistibly drawn to it, which is a wonderful account of a Reformed idea of your free will and your determination at the same time. If you see a perfect beauty, you can't help being drawn to it, but nonetheless, it's your choice. It's both. So, but my question as a historian is, why didn't I discover Edwards in my prior 24 years? I was brought up in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. My father was a pastor and then a church mission secretary, church executive at Westminster Seminary. Our house was filled with books, literally to the ceiling, but there wasn't anything on Jonathan Edwards there. So that was the curiosity, and maybe more of a curiosity. I had just graduated from Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, and there Edwards was taught with some respect in the church history course, and as a very important figure and revivalist. But in the theology courses, he was hardly mentioned. He was not on the radar of the theology. And so I wondered, why was that? And shortly after after I had encountered Edwards at Yale and began to appreciate him, I went back to visit friends at Westminster, and I talked to John Murray, who taught the wonderful, almost Edwardsian-like lecturer in his intensity and piety, and that came through. And I asked him, well, what do you think about Jonathan Edwards? And he says in his Scottish brogue, he's wonderful, but it wasn't, he didn't really incorporate it into his theology. And the problem was, of course, that the faculty at Westminster had been trained at Princeton. They were loyal to the old Princeton, and particularly Charles Hodge was the point of reference in their theology. And so in the systematic theology courses, we didn't really study Hodge, but there was an exam you had to take on the 3 volumes of Hodge's systematic theology. So that Princeton outlook had not been all that sympathetic to Edwards, and Edwards just wasn't quite there on their horizons. So and I think by today it's pretty clear that sort of neglect by a very strongly reformed seminary was accidental rather than principial in any substantial way. In fact, I had the experience shortly after my book, Jonathan Edwards: A Life, came out. I was honored by an honorary degree at Westminster Seminary, and the president at the time, Sam Logan, is a great fan of Jonathan Edwards. And as I said at the time, I think he wanted to give the degree to Edwards, but I was there as a stand-in. But by that time, Edwards had become preeminent, one of the preeminent figures in the theological hierarchy of American Reformed people. The best known preacher to have studied at Westminster was Tim Keller, and he is a great fan of Edwards. And it wasn't much after that I think 2006 or 8, Time magazine came out with one of the 10 things ideas that are changing the world right now, and the new Calvinism was one of the ideas, and that was the time of the book that I borrowed the title from, Colin Hansen's book, Young, Restless, and Reformed, and it featured on the cover, Jonathan Edwards is my homeboy. So Edwards had become not a pop figure, but it's certainly in certain circles, he was the point of reference. So my historical question is, what happened in those 40 years, really, to bring Edwards from relative obscurity, even in Reformed circles, to the standing that he has today? And to explain that, I think there's two parallel stories. One of those stories is the story of the rediscovery of Edwards in the Reformed community, and then that story parallels and eventually dovetails with the story, really prior story of the recovery of Edwards in the mainstream academic and theological community, American academic and theological communities. I'm pretty sure that my experience in the 1950s and 60s of Edwards being not very popular in the Reformed circles was pretty typical. The one exception was John Gerstner. John Gerstner had studied at Westminster Seminary in the late 1930s. Then he took a PhD degree at Harvard. It finished in 1945. And at some point along the line, he developed a great interest in Jonathan Edwards, and that became his primary interest. And he then began to go to Yale and to do research in the Edwards papers, which at that time was a very lengthy process because everything in principle was available, but it would take you, a week to read a sermon. So anyway, Gerstner was one of the early people to work on that. And because of that, he was enlisted by the people that were beginning the Yale project to begin publishing the works of Jonathan Edwards. In 1959, Gerstner published a book called The Steps to Salvation, showing that Edwards' sermons show him to be thoroughly reformed in his views of great salvation and grace. Even though Gerstner was a Westminster grad and I was at Westminster around that time, I never heard of that book. As far as I know, it wasn't really mentioned. Gerstner was very influential in his own, what's the name of the church? Anyway, and in his own denomination, he taught at Xenia Seminary, which was a seminary of the one of the smaller Reformed groups. I can't think of the name. Anyway, then he had most of his influence through the Ligonier Ministries and R.C. Sproul, and that was a way of promoting Edwards. But Gerstner's Edwards was very much a Princetonian Edwards. He actually was at a conference here in Grand Rapids in 1956, held at Calvin Seminary when it was on Franklin Street. And he assured the suspicious Dutch at that time, who were suspicious of most anything American, that Edwards was not tainted by American heresies that had grown out of the New England theology. The Dutch had heard of New England theology and that it went bad. So Gerstner said, the mantle of Edwards fell not on the Taylors, Bushnells, Parks, Beechers, or Gladdens, but the Alexanders, the Hodges, the Pattons, and the Warfields. In Edwards, on another occasion, emphasized how highly Edwards regarded the inerrancy of Scripture, which was, of course, true. But that was the kind of thing that was very important. Gerstner, in certain Reformed circles, that Gerstner sometimes taught at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and that was one of the chief tests of the faith at Trinity Divinity School during that time. And then Gerstner's 3-volume work on Edwards is called the Rational Biblical Theology of Jonathan Edwards. So I think it's a very Princetonian take on Edwards, and looking at Edwards as someone who had really good rational arguments for traditional Reformed doctrines, for Puritan's doctrines, but Edwards gives you the good arguments for those kinds of things. So Gerstner wasn't seeing Edwards particularly as a brilliant innovator, but rather more as a defender of the faith. Another Reformed influence, I think probably had more impact in the long run, was the Banner of Truth Trust and the influence of Ian Murray. The Banner of Truth Trust was founded in 1957 and probably, I imagine, has been an influence in this institution. And the Banner of Truth Trust did a great service, I think from Ian Murray, of republishing the 2-volume 19th century edition of Edwards' works and making them more widely available in Reformed circles and promoting Edwards as a really important Reformed thinker. And in 1987, Ian Murray came out with his Jonathan Edwards, A New Biography, which is well researched and sympathetic to Edwards. And it's a very sort of intensely Puritan Edwards, Edwards of great piety and insight and intellect that sparked Reformed revivalism, and that fit right in with the Banner of Truth Trust emphasis. So there were modest promotions of Edwards, but not so much along the line of seeing Edwards as a great innovator, but rather seeing him as someone who was a great defender and then also promoter of the Reformed faith. Well, I'll come back to the Reformed story, but then I think we first need to, we have to go back to the prior, what's really starts as a prior story in the mainstream Protestant and Neo-Orthodox and academic circles. First of all, I think for that story, it's helpful to recall or know that by the early 20th century, the typical Jonathan Edwards that was around in American academia was a pretty dour figure with a negative reputation. The one thing that Americans read of Edwards and all the literature books was Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and that was used as an example of literary imagery, but also as an example of what we've gotten past, the old repressive Puritan past that might have been blamed for prohibition or anything people didn't, any kind of repression that there was in the Victorian era. There's a quotation from a book called The Fiery Puritan by Henry Bamford Parks, writing in the 1920s, who says that, this is a quote, if Edwards had thought more deeply, he might have been the greatest figure in the history of American thought. So Edwards' fault was he didn't really think through things, which if you read Edwards, you wonder how someone could come to that conclusion. Another example is in 1940, there was a much more sympathetic biography of Edwards by Ola Winslow, trying to humanize him. But even she says that Edwards spoke through an outworn dogmatic system that needed to be discarded. So he was the voice, a great man, great thinker, but a voice of the past. So Edwards, in that view, was essentially a non-creative thinker as well, who was locked into a theological tradition that didn't really let him think things through in the way he should have. He wasn't nearly as open-minded as you were supposed to be. But already by the mid-20th century, the mainline take on Edwards was beginning to change. There was a sympathetic biography of Edwards by somebody or other. can't think of who it was, but anyway, there's another, McGifford wrote a sympathetic account of Edwards. And then came along Perry Miller, who was a literary historian at Harvard, a great intellectual historian, an atheist himself, but who discovered in Edwards the most powerful American thinker, and had the thesis in doing American intellectual history that everything's been downhill since the Puritans, and that America has drifted into anti-intellectualism, and Edwards was a great genius. And Miller wrote a biography of Edwards, came out in 1949, I think it was, that emphasized Edwards as the creative genius out in the woods by himself, sort of a Emersonian kind of character who grasped the meaning of life, just sort of more or less on his own, as though he didn't even have a theological tradition, or that he was transcending the tradition. And also, actually prior to Miller, there was a beginning of a neo-Orthodox appropriation of Edwards. And actually the McGifford biography in the 30s was one example of that. And then the other major example was a book by Joseph Haratunian called From Piety to Moralism. And it's on what he calls the passing of the New England theology. And that told the story essentially of the decline in New England theology from Edwards, that they could not keep up with the grandeur of Edwards' thought. And so by the mid-20th century, Edwards was beginning to have a really strong reputation, particularly in neo-Orthodox circles, among people who were trying to recover some emphasis on the grandeur of God, the sovereignty of God, but didn't want to go back as far as the more traditional theologies. H. Richard Niebuhr at Yale in the 1940s and 1950s was a promoter of Edwards, but Niebuhr's theology was essentially I think it's essentially a kind of Unitarianism, emphasizing, though, the grandeur of God, and seeing Edwards as great as someone who promoted that kind of vision without the sort of taking it all totally literally. So that combination of neo-Orthodox, some very great leading theological scholars are beginning to appropriate Edwards in the mid-century, and Perry Miller, Harvard secularist, led to the founding of the Yale Works of Edwards project in the 1950s. Perry Miller was instrumental in promoting it, but people at Yale, since the papers were at Yale, that was the place where the project developed. Yale was the ideal place for that, not only because of the papers, but because it was a leading center of what I'm calling neo-Orthodox kinds of theology. So by the time I came on the scene in the 1960s, Edwards was already being highly revered, both in the intellectual world and in the mainstream theological world. Douglas Elwood's book, the book that I was mentioned before, was published in 1960. It had Joseph Haratunian wrote the preface for that. It was very much in that kind of tradition, but getting close to the heart of some of Edwards' original emphases. Robert Jensen's 1968 book on the, Roland Delaterre's 1968 on beauty and sensibility in Edwards' thought underscored that kind of emphasis as well, the emphasis on beauty in Edwards, and that idea was beginning to develop. In 1988, Robert Jensen provided what I think was sort of the culmination of the neo-Orthodox Edwards in a book with a rather optimistic title of America's Theologian, subtitled A Recommendation of Jonathan Edwards. And Jensen's very flattering of Edwards, and this is where Americans should be headed. But Jensen's Edwards turns out to be an awful lot like Karl Barth. Well, this neo-Orthodox and mainstream Protestant recovery for Edwards was, I think, an essential component of the Reformed rediscovery of Edwards, and I think the two movements dovetailed. I think for the Reformed recovery of Edwards to build, Reformed Edwards had to be not just the defender of the faith Edwards, but which Edwards certainly was, but also the creative Edwards, the Edwards of brilliant insights into the Reformed and more deeply into the Augustinian tradition. So, for instance, I think a particularly important figure in bringing those two things together was Richard Lovelace at Gordon Conwell Divinity School. Richard Lovelace published a book called The Dynamics of Spiritual Life, an Evangelical Theology of Renewal. Lovelace was Reformed, but he was also influenced by a pietistic, charismatic movement within the Reformed tradition. So his Edwards was an Edwards of great insights, but also of great spiritual intensity, and one who would be promoting revival in some ways, like the Banner of Truth Edwards, but putting him more in the broader theological tradition. And the first chapter of Lovelace's book is called Jonathan Edwards and the Jesus Movement. So he's bringing together the idea that revival has very deep roots and substantial roots in the Christian tradition. And Lovelace's book is it's Reformed, but it's a very ecumenical kind of reform, being generous toward the people that you disagree with. Tim Keller, who studied at Gordon Conwell before he went to Westminster, says this: I took several courses from Richard Lovelace at Gordon Conwell Seminary, including the first course, Dynamics of Spiritual Life, in the fall of 1972, that eventually became Lovelace's book. Along with that course, I also took a course he did on Evangelical Awakenings, a History of Revivals. To say that these courses were seminal in my thinking and way of doing ministry is a pretty big understatement. Anyone who knows my ministry and reads this book will say, so that's where Keller got all his stuff. And I think a generation of evangelicals who read Lovelace or were in touch with Gordon Conwell were influenced with that kind of high regard for Edwards. Garth Roselle picked up that mantle as well. Excuse me. Meanwhile, on the other coast, John Piper discovered Jonathan Edwards at Fuller Theological Seminary. About the same time, sometime around 1970, he was taking a course from his favorite professor, Daniel Fuller, and someone had accused Fuller of being too rationalistic. And Fuller was sort of upset by that. And so, according to Piper, he said to the student who criticized him, Jonathan Edwards could move easily from lucid, complex, logical arguments into a devotional style that would warm your grandmother's heart. And so Piper writes, that was all I needed. I was off to the library to find this hidden treasure. So Piper talks as though he discovered the kinds of things he admires in Edwards pretty much on his own, but he's also clearly influenced by this other literature, sort of the mainstream Protestant literature on Edwards, to find the grandeur of God and the centrality of God, the reason why God created the universe, and all those kinds of emphasis that you can find in Piper's books on Edwards, and the emphasis on joy and beauty is all being refracted into a version of the Reformed tradition. So Piper's Edwards is not just a defender of the faith, though he also is that, but he's someone who is seeing Edwards as providing a new dynamic for understanding the faith or illuminating the faith more intensely. Now, I don't know, some of you may have stricter standards as what counts for truly Reformed than you may have very strict standards what counts as truly Reformed, but let's say I'm speaking more as a historian and saying these people who regard themselves as Reformed, this is the way they appropriated Edwards. I find it revealing that both Keller and Piper say that C.S. Lewis was a comparable influence to Edwards, and I think you can find online, you can find some discussion between them talking about both Lewis and Edwards, or maybe separately, but anyway, they both, and I recently had the opportunity to write a little book about C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity and how it developed, and I've been struck by the parallels between Lewis and Edwards. And actually, I've taught some courses on that Lewis was a theological minimalist, and Edwards is a theological maximalist, that Edwards always goes 3 times deeper into anything than maybe you need to in order to make it clear. But he's always heading off all the objections, whereas Lewis is trying to get to that core way of just nailing something in one little image. But there's a lot of, despite some differences, there's a lot of parallel, because they're both grounded in the Augustinian tradition. And so when they're talking about things like beauty or the centrality of God's love in holding up reality, there is at least a good bit of similarity. And Lewis and Edwards were discovered in the American theological community more or less at the same time, in the later decades of the 20th century. And I think that that's part of a general response to the anti-intellectualism that's so deeply found in American evangelicalism. And there's a lot of people who discover these. Here are some Christians who are really thinking much more deeply and referring you to, the whole tradition of Christianity, and not just to what the latest guru says, or what you can get tomorrow out of the gospel message. So that, I think, is one of the important reasons for the rediscovery of Edwards, that people are looking for something more more deeper representations of the theology that they have some sensibilities about already. And I think, as Adrian has said, around the world, that has happened too. That as Edwards is online, people just discover Edwards and begin reading Edwards on their own as something. Boy, this is a kind. This really brings things together in Christianity. I also like to think that we historians had a little bit to do with the recovery of Edwards. For instance, in 1994, Mark Knoll, my close friend and colleague, wrote a sort of Jeremiad called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And Knoll presents Edwards as an exemplar of what the evangelical mind might be. He's also responding to this anti-intellectualism. And then he laments, Edwards had no intellectual successors. And he follows that up with a much larger book called America's God from Jonathan Edwards to Abraham Lincoln, and impressively elaborates that point of sort of the decline of American theology, but I think in a much more responsible way than, say, Haratunian's way of doing it 50 years, 60 years earlier. Also, by about the 1980s, Edwards, due to the influence of Knoll and also his friend Nathan Hatch, they were both Wheaton graduates in the same class as John Piper, by the way, and they brought Edwards to Wheaton. 1984, we had a conference there on Jonathan Edwards where we invited both the mainstream scholars and more evangelical Reformed scholars to talk about Edwards, and that led to an early book on Jonathan Edwards and the American experience, and Nathan Hatch became one of the editors of one of the volumes of sermons in the Edwards Study series. So I think that those are just instances of the convergence of the mainline Edwards and the Reformed, more evangelical Edwards. And then that began to consolidate at the Jonathan Edwards Center in 1986. Harry Stout, who had been a student of mine at Calvin College long ago, came to Yale and eventually became the Jonathan Edwards professor or something or other, and is a great promoter of things. And he was instrumental in sort of building the Edwards Center, and he brought Kenneth Minkema, who another Calvin College graduate, to Yale. And Minkema turned out to be the person who can read Edwards' work the best, and apparently he's a phenomenon at deciphering this. And so Minkema really made the project soar in the 1990s, and suddenly and had a lot of younger scholars working on that as well. Douglas Sweeney, who was the head of the Edwards Center at Trinity prior to this one, was one of those people working with Minkema at that time. So there's a kind of convergence in that project as well, and so and that project has led to then the development of Edwards as a world phenomenon, and Adrian has had a good bit to do about that, and he could talk about that story, which is still developing. So I think just the sheer availability of Edwards' works that the Yale project has accomplished is one of the necessary conditions for this recovery. But also, I think it's not just that, but it's the luminous quality of some of the insights that Edwards has that people in Africa, discover that, and what I think, what I saw in 1963, and lots of other people have found in their when they really get into Edwards, and I think that draws people toward admiring Edwards, and it's a Reformed faith drawing on the Augustinian Calvinist tradition, and then sort of getting to at least some very important aspects of its emphases. So I think it's Edwards, the consistent Reformed Edwards is a very important dimension of Edwards, but then it's Edwards, the Edwards of great illumination that points you toward seeing God's beauty, to seeing that as a central beauty that draws you toward that Trinitarian vision of reality, that the beauty that the universe is here as an expression of the love of the Trinity, and if you see that love, if you're given eyes to see that love, then you're going to be drawn into it. So I've been honored to be at least an observer of this, of these developments, and I think it's been a marvelous development, and I'm certainly glad that there's an Edwards Center here, and I can say from having taught Edwards at Calvin Theological Seminary quite a few times, there's a lot of interest down the road too in Edwards. So thank you very much.